The courtroom doors creaked open and the hushed whispers of the gathered crowd filled the room as everyone took their seats. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of tension that comes with a case that has captured the attention of an entire city. Emma sat quietly in the front row, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes red from the sleepless nights she had spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life had come to this point. The daughter of a respected police chief, now at the center of a scandal that could destroy everything her father had worked for. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that weighed heavily on her chest, the fear of what was to come, what would happen in this room, where everything was laid bare for all to see. Her once peaceful life had been shattered that night when Officer Nolan pulled her over for a routine traffic stop. Or so she thought at first. What she didn't know was that the simple mistake of one officer would lead her to this moment where her name was not only associated with her father's badge, but also with a blunder that no one would forget. Her father sat beside her, trying his best to remain composed, but even he couldn't mask the fury that burned behind his eyes every time he glanced toward the defendant's box, where Officer Nolan sat, his shoulders hunched in guilt, his eyes downcast, trying to avoid making contact with the family he had wronged. Emma's mother, Linda, sat stiffly next to them, her gaze fixed ahead, her face a mask of calm. But there was a noticeable tension in the way she held herself. A mother's instinct to protect her child was still fighting against the raw emotion of seeing her daughter subjected to something so unjust. The judge entered the courtroom and everyone stood at once. The room fell silent as the proceedings began. The prosecutor was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the stillness as he made his opening statement. He spoke with authority as he outlined the events of that fateful night. Officer Nolan had pulled over Emma's car, claiming she was speeding or acting suspicious. He couldn't quite remember the details, but what followed was a series of errors that led to the young woman's wrongful arrest. Emma had been confused, terrified, and humiliated as she was cuffed and taken into custody. The prosecutor made it clear this was not just a simple mistake. This was a failure of judgment, one that could have been prevented if Officer Nolan had followed proper protocol, if he had only taken a moment to consider who Emma was instead of reacting out of fear or misunderstanding. Emma glanced at the officer now sitting in the defendant's box. She could see the sweat beading on his forehead, and the way his hands trembled slightly. He looked nothing like the confident man she had seen in uniform during her childhood. A part of her wanted to feel angry at him, but instead she only felt sorry for him because she knew what was at stake for him now, his career, his reputation, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. As the prosecutor continued to speak, Emma's mind wandered back to that night when everything had gone wrong, when she had been pulled from her car and treated like a criminal. She could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs around her wrists, the confusion, the panic as she was led to the police car without explanation. But she wasn't just the police chief's daughter that night. She was a scared young woman who had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was in a courtroom where her name would be forever linked to this unfortunate event. Emma shifted uneasily in her seat. The cold wooden bench beneath her felt hard against her back as she glanced around the courtroom. Everything seemed so much bigger now, the high ceilings, the rows of seats filled with onlookers, the judge sitting high above them. It was all so overwhelming. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, as if she were being judged, not just for what happened that night, but for who she was and what her father represented. Emma tried to focus on the proceedings, but her thoughts kept wandering back to the arrest, the confusion of that moment when Officer Nolan had pulled her over. Her father was sitting beside her, his large frame tense as he listened intently to the prosecutor's words. Emma could feel the weight of his anger radiating from him. Even though he didn't say a word, she knew what he was thinking. How could this happen? How could an officer of the law make such a terrible mistake? The man who had spent his career upholding justice now had to watch as his daughter's life was torn apart by the same system he had dedicated his life to serving. Police Chief Carter had always been a figure of strength in Emma's life, a steady presence who had taught her right from wrong and showed her what it meant to fight for justice, no matter the cost. But now he sat there in silence, his jaw clenched with frustration, unable to do anything but watch as the case unfolded in front of him. The defense attorney stood up next, his voice smooth and calculated as he addressed the court. He tried to paint Officer Nolan as a man who had acted out of duty, one who had simply made a mistake in the heat of the moment. But Emma could hear the underlying tone of desperation in his words, the need to justify actions that were difficult to explain away. Nolan had acted on instinct when he pulled her over. He believed there was something off about Emma, the way she had driven through the intersection, the way she seemed distracted or nervous. But none of that explained why he had rushed to arrest her with no real evidence, no real reason to treat her like a criminal instead of a young woman simply trying to get home. The defense attorney continued to argue that Nolan had followed protocol, that he had acted within the scope of his duties as a police officer, but Emma could see through it. The words were empty. They didn't change the fact that her life had been turned upside down because of one man's mistake. Her thoughts were interrupted as the courtroom doors opened and a new figure stepped into the room. It was Linda, Emma's mother, who had been silent up until that point. She had always been the calm and steady one, the one who kept her emotions in check for the sake of the family. But today there was something different in her eyes as she walked toward the stand. Linda's voice shook as she began to speak, describing the nightmare of that night, the phone call from the precinct telling her that Emma had been arrested. She recalled the long hours of waiting, not knowing where her daughter was or when she would be released, the fear, the helplessness. It was all too much to bear as a mother who had never imagined that something like this could happen to her family. As Linda spoke, Emma could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. She had never seen her mother like this before, so vulnerable, so broken. The weight of the injustice felt heavier now that she could see the toll it had taken on both of her parents. She wasn't just the victim of a wrongful arrest. She was the cause of so much pain for those who loved her, and that was something she would never forget. The room grew quieter as Linda finished her testimony, her words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Emma could feel the shift in the atmosphere the moment her mother's voice faltered, as if the very act of speaking the truth was a burden too great to bear. But Emma knew her mother's words carried more weight than anyone could imagine. Linda had always been the rock of their family, the one who kept everything together, but now she was unraveling in front of everyone. It was a sight Emma had never thought she would see. The woman who had always been calm and composed, now broken by the same system she had trusted to protect her child. As Linda sat down, Emma reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly, trying to offer comfort. Even though she felt like she was the one who needed it more than anyone else, Emma could feel her heart racing as the weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders. The room felt suffocating now, with all the eyes trained on them, watching and waiting for the next moment to unfold. The defense attorney seemed to sense the shift in energy as well, his earlier confident posture now faltering as he gathered his notes and looked toward the judge. Emma could see the way he shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of the courtroom. He was trying his best to turn the narrative in favor of Officer Nolan, but Emma knew it wasn't going to work. It wasn't just about following protocol or making the right call. It was about understanding who the person was in front of you, and Officer Nolan had failed to do that. The prosecutor stood once again, his voice cutting through the silence as he began to summarize the case. He spoke with conviction as he detailed the critical moments that led to Emma's wrongful arrest, the lack of probable cause, the failure to verify her identity, the way Officer Nolan had acted out of assumption rather than fact. He laid it all out for the jury to see, and Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as the truth finally came to light. But there was something more at play here than just the legal proceedings. There was a deeper sense of betrayal, something that went beyond the courtroom and into the very fabric of Emma's life. The trust she had always placed in the law was now shattered. The belief that the system would always protect her had been replaced with the harsh reality that sometimes even the most trusted figures could make terrible mistakes. As the prosecutor spoke, Emma found herself staring at Officer Nolan, who had yet to look up from his lap, his face a mask of guilt and shame. She could see the way his hands trembled as he held onto the edges of the defendant's box, as though he was trying to hold himself together. But there was no hiding the truth of what had happened. He had made a mistake, one that had cost Emma everything, and now he was forced to sit there and face the consequences. Emma tried to steady her breathing, but the emotions were rising within her faster than she could contain them. The frustration, the anger, the sadness, all of it swirling together like a storm inside of her. But she couldn't let it overwhelm her, not now, not when she was so close to the truth finally being revealed. She had come this far, she couldn't falter now. As the prosecutor finished his argument, the room fell into silence once again, and Emma could feel the eyes of the jury on her as they weighed the case before them. She knew what was coming, she could sense it in the air. The moment of truth would come soon, and she just hoped it would be enough to bring justice, not just for her, but for her family too. Emma's heart raced as she watched her father step forward toward the witness stand, his tall figure cutting through the tension in the room like a beacon of strength. But she could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the situation bearing down on him as he faced the jury, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw set tight. He had always been the steady hand in their family, the one who had never let anything shake him, but today was different. Today, he was not just a police chief, he was a father who had seen his daughter wrongly arrested and humiliated in front of the world. The room grew still as her father took the oath, his deep voice filling the space as he swore to tell the truth. His eyes locked onto the jury, but Emma could tell his thoughts were elsewhere. They were on her, and on the injustice that had befallen their family. She could feel his anger simmering just beneath the surface, but he spoke calmly when he began to recount the events of that night, his voice steady and controlled, but there was an undeniable edge to it as he described how he had received the call from the precinct, telling him that Emma had been arrested without cause. He didn't speak for a moment, as if trying to hold back the raw emotion that threatened to spill over, but the words finally came out like a flood when he spoke of how he rushed to the station, the fear and disbelief that had gripped him when he saw his daughter in handcuffs sitting in that cold holding cell, unable to understand why this had happened to her, a young woman with a clean record who had always followed the rules, who had done nothing wrong, and yet there she was, a criminal in the eyes of the law. The silence in the courtroom was heady as Chief Carter described the confusion and the anger he had felt that night, but his voice never wavered as he continued to tell this story. It was clear that his daughter's pain had become his own. The weight of her suffering was something he could not escape, as much as he wished to protect her from this nightmare. He knew there was nothing he could do but stand by her side and watch as the system that he had spent his life serving failed her. He paused for a moment before speaking again, this time his voice quieter, but the words carrying even more weight when he spoke of the trust he had placed in Officer Nolan over the years, the trust that had been shattered in an instant. The betrayal he felt was palpable. It was a feeling that Emma could understand all too well, the feeling of being let down by someone you had always believed in. Her father's testimony was a turning point in the trial. The emotional weight of his words seemed to shift the atmosphere in the courtroom, and for a moment Emma thought she saw a flicker of doubt in Officer Nolan's eyes, but he quickly looked away, his face red with embarrassment and shame as he tried to avoid the gaze of the Carters. Emma's father finished his testimony with a simple yet powerful statement that this was not just a mistake, it was a failure of judgment, a failure to recognize who Emma was and what she represented to him and to their family. It was a failure that had caused untold pain and humiliation, but it was also a failure that would never be forgotten, not by him, not by Emma, and certainly not by anyone in the room. As he stepped down from the stand, Emma felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude for her father. Even in the face of everything that had happened, he had remained strong for her, and she knew that no matter what happened next, he would always be there to protect her, no matter the cost. The defense attorney stood up and adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the tension that still lingered in the room. As he slowly made his way toward the witness stand, he was ready to challenge everything that had been said up until this point, ready to present Officer Nolan, not as a man who had made a terrible mistake, but as someone who had simply acted within the bounds of his duties. His voice smooth and practiced as he addressed the jury, he painted a picture of a well-meaning officer, a man dedicated to his job, who had followed protocol when faced with what he believed to be a suspicious situation. The defense began by calling Officer Nolan to the stand. The courtroom held its breath as Nolan slowly rose from his seat, his hands trembling as he approached the stand, his eyes locked onto the floor, his face pale and drawn. He was not the confident officer who had once worn his uniform with pride. He was a man shattered by the weight of his own actions. Emma could see the guilt in his eyes even before he began to speak, and for a moment she felt a wave of pity for him despite everything that had happened. Nolan's voice cracked as he began to testify. He spoke of the night in question, how he had pulled Emma over because of what he believed to be erratic driving, how he had noticed her looking distracted and nervous. He admitted that he had acted on instinct, believing that something was off, but what he didn't say was how quickly he had jumped to conclusions, how he had failed to ask the right questions or gather the right information before making his decision to arrest her. He spoke of the fear that gripped him in that moment, but his words felt empty. They lacked conviction, and Emma could sense that the courtroom was starting to question his motives. As the defense attorney pressed him further, asking about his training and experience in handling situations like this, Nolan's responses became more hesitant, more uncertain. He spoke about how he had followed protocol and how he had only arrested Emma because he thought she might be hiding something, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to justify his actions to himself. More than anyone else, she could hear the cracks in his testimony, the inconsistencies that seemed to reveal his doubt. The defense attorney, sensing the shift in the room, attempted to steer the narrative back in his favor. He spoke about the dangers of second-guessing officers in the field and how the split-second decisions they were forced to make could have serious consequences. He made it seem as though Nolan had no choice but to act the way he had, but to Emma it felt like a feeble excuse. It wasn't just about protocol or making the right call, it was about seeing her as a person and not as a threat, but Officer Nolan had failed to see that. The defense attorney's words continued to echo in Emma's mind as he tried to paint Nolan as a hero who had simply made an unfortunate error. She watched as he turned toward the jury, his eyes filled with determination as he implored them to understand that no officer could predict every situation and that this was just one of those rare instances where things went wrong. But Emma knew better. She knew that this wasn't about a mistake, it was about a lack of judgment, a failure to recognize the humanity in the person you were arresting. Emma's thoughts swirled as the defense wrapped up his questioning. She could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders. The eyes of the jury focused on her as they tried to piece together the events of that night and what had led to her being wrongfully arrested by someone who should have known better. But she wasn't sure if they could see past the officer's explanations or if they would truly understand the depth of the harm he had caused. She glanced at her father, who sat in the front row, his face set in a grim line. He had fought for justice his entire career, but now it was his daughter who needed it most, and she wondered if the system that had failed her once would do so again. Officer Nolan's testimony hung in the air like a weight pressing down on Emma as the defense attorney finished his questions. The room fell silent for a moment before the prosecutor stood up again, his movements deliberate and steady. As he approached the witness stand this time, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt charged. There was a sense of urgency in the air as the prosecutor began to dismantle the defense's argument piece by piece. He started by questioning Officer Nolan's actions that night, his voice calm but filled with an underlying intensity. He asked about the initial traffic stop and why Nolan had immediately jumped to conclusions about Emma's behavior. Why hadn't he followed standard procedure and simply asked her for identification? Why hadn't he taken the time to assess the situation before making the decision to arrest her? The questions came fast and relentless, but Nolan's responses grew more hesitant with each passing one. He couldn't seem to explain his reasoning for acting so swiftly without gathering more information, without giving Emma the benefit of the doubt. The prosecutor didn't let up. He continued to highlight the inconsistencies in Nolan's testimony, pointing out the contradictions between what Nolan had said earlier and the evidence presented by the witnesses who had seen the arrest take place. He spoke of Emma's calm and respectful demeanor during the encounter, the way she had tried to explain herself, but was met with the officer's quick judgment instead of understanding. The prosecutor's words were sharp, cutting through the defense's narrative like a knife. Emma felt a surge of emotion rise within her as the prosecutor's words sank in. She could feel the anger building up inside of her at the injustice of it all. She had been treated like a criminal when all she had done was drive home from a late-night study session, and now here she was watching as Officer Nolan tried to excuse his actions with weak justifications that only made it clearer how little he had thought about her as a person. The prosecutor then turned to the issue of racial profiling. He asked Officer Nolan if there had been any indication that Emma was involved in anything suspicious based on her race or her background. Nolan stuttered and faltered under the pressure as the prosecutor pressed him further on this point. It was clear that the officer had no real explanation for why he had singled Emma out, why he had assumed she was hiding something when there was no evidence to support such a claim. Emma felt the weight of those questions pressing down on her, and for a moment it felt as though time had slowed. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. She could hear the quiet murmur of the jury members as they leaned in to listen intently to the prosecution's case. She had become more than just a victim of a wrongful arrest. She had become a symbol of something larger, a reminder of the flaws in the system and the way people like Officer Nolan had the power to make snap judgments that could ruin lives. As the prosecutor finished his questioning, Emma could see the crack in Nolan's composure. He was no longer the confident officer sitting proudly on the stand. Now he was a man broken by the weight of his own actions. His shoulders slumped and his hands were trembling again, as if he could no longer hold up the facade of justification that he had tried so hard to maintain. The truth was starting to seep through the cracks, and the reality of his mistake was settling in. The room held its breath as the defense attorney stood to cross-examine the prosecutor. But Emma could already feel the shift in the room. The tide had turned and the balance of power had shifted in her favor. For the first time since that fateful night, Emma felt a glimmer of hope that justice might actually be served after all. The defense attorney rose slowly, his face a mask of frustration as he adjusted his papers and moved toward the stand to begin his cross-examination of the prosecutor. He was clearly struggling to regain control of the situation, but it was evident that the momentum had shifted in favor of the prosecution. The tone of the room had changed. The jury now looked more skeptical of Officer Nolan's actions, their eyes sharper and more critical as the defense attorney tried to present his case. But no one seemed convinced by his arguments. He began by asking Nolan questions again, trying to dig deeper into the details of the arrest. but there was a noticeable lack of confidence in his approach. Nolan seemed smaller now, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a man who was no longer sure of his own defense. He fumbled over his words as the defense attorney pushed him on certain details, asking why he hadn't followed proper procedure when arresting Emma, why he hadn't considered the possibility that she was just an ordinary person making her way home. The questions came rapid fire, but they felt less powerful now, as though the defense was grasping at straws, trying to salvage a case that had already begun to unravel. Emma watched carefully as Nolan struggled to answer the questions, his hands still trembling, his voice shaking as he tried to explain himself. But every time he opened his mouth, he only seemed to dig himself deeper into a hole. The truth was becoming clearer to everyone in the room. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had acted out of bias and assumption, a rush to judgment that had cost Emma her dignity, her peace, and her reputation. But the defense attorney pressed on, still trying to find some way to excuse the officer's actions, some way to justify what had happened, but it was no use. The prosecutor stood again, now ready to respond, his voice cutting through the air with authority. He began to dismantle the defense's weak arguments, one by one, asking why Nolan hadn't done more to verify Emma's identity, why he hadn't followed the proper steps before deciding to arrest her. He also reminded the court of the lack of any real evidence that Emma had done anything wrong. She had been calm, cooperative, and respectful throughout the entire interaction, and yet she had been treated like a criminal. The prosecutor's words were sharp and direct. He didn't leave room for doubt. He made it clear that this wasn't just a simple mistake. This was an act of negligence and poor judgment. Emma could feel her heart pounding as the prosecutor spoke. She had never imagined she would find herself in the middle of such a battle. The idea that a simple traffic stop could turn into something so life-altering seemed almost surreal to her. But as the prosecutor laid out the facts, she realized how much had been at stake, how much her life had been disrupted because of one officer's failure to think critically. Her mind flashed back to the moments of her arrest, when she had been yanked out of her car and thrown into handcuffs. She remembered the confusion, the panic, the overwhelming sense of injustice that had washed over her. But as she sat there now listening to the prosecutor break down the case, she felt a sense of relief building within her. It was like a weight was lifting slowly off her chest. She could see that the case was turning in her favor, that the truth was coming to light, and she didn't have to carry the burden of guilt or shame any longer. As the prosecutor finished his remarks, the defense attorney seemed to have lost his will to argue further. He sat down heavily, his face a picture of frustration and defeat. Emma couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph as she looked around the courtroom. She could feel her father's supportive presence beside her, his steady hand on her shoulder, offering silent reassurance. But more than anything, she felt a renewed sense of hope that this nightmare might finally be coming to an end and justice might be within her reach. The courtroom was silent as the defense attorney returned to his seat, his shoulders slumped in resignation. The prosecutor stood tall with a quiet confidence, knowing that he had made a compelling case. But even with the weight of the evidence on his side, Emma still felt a twinge of uncertainty deep inside her heart. The journey was far from over. The final verdict had yet to be delivered, and while things seemed to be turning in her favor, she couldn't help but worry about what the jury would decide. No matter how strong the case was, there was always the possibility that things could go awry, that the system she had once believed in might not deliver the justice she so desperately needed. The judge, who had been watching carefully from his seat at the front of the courtroom, finally addressed the jury, his voice commanding and firm, instructing them to deliberate and return with their verdict. Emma could feel her breath catch in her throat. As the words hung in the air, the weight of it all settled on her chest. She glanced at her father, who sat next to her, his expression unreadable, but his presence comforting in its quiet strength. Her mother sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mixture of concern and hope. The three of them had been through so much in the past few days, so much pain, so much confusion, and now it all came down to this moment, the moment when the fate of everything would be decided by 12 strangers. The jury members filed out of the courtroom, each of them walking slowly with deliberate steps, their faces difficult to read. As they passed Emma and her family, Emma couldn't help but wonder what they were thinking, what conclusions they had drawn as they watched the trial unfold. Did they see the same things she saw, or had they been swayed by the defense's arguments? Emma tried not to let herself think too much about it, but the uncertainty gnawed at her all the same. As the jury left for deliberation, time seemed to stretch on forever. The courtroom cleared out slowly, and Emma found herself alone with her parents. In the long, quiet moments that followed, the weight of the past few days settled heavily over them, and Emma felt the urge to speak, but no words came. Her mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts, and none of them made sense. It was like everything had become a blur. The images of the night she had been arrested, the courtroom, the endless arguments, and now the jury deliberating on her fate. It was all too much for her to process in such a short amount of time. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm, a gentle. He didn't speak right away, but Emma could feel his presence comforting her despite the uncertainty they all faced. His eyes met hers, and she saw something there, a flicker of pride perhaps, or maybe it was just the deep love he had for her. Whatever it was, it gave her strength in that moment, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had been through so much already, and she couldn't let fear control her now. Minutes turned into hours as they waited, and during that time Emma found herself reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point, the life she had lived before the arrest, the way everything had been turned upside down, the deep sense of betrayal she had felt, but also the unwavering support of her family, who had stood by her side no matter what. She realized that no matter the outcome of the trial, she had learned something important about herself, about the strength she didn't know she had, and about the people who loved her and would fight for her no matter what. And then finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the courtroom opened, and the jury filed back in, their faces solemn and unreadable. Emma's heart raced in her chest as the judge called the court to order. She couldn't look away from the jury as they took their seats. The final moment had arrived, and her fate hung in the balance. The room fell into a heavy silence as the jury took their seats, the tension palpable as everyone waited for the foreman to speak. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her palms clammy with nerves. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to focus on the foreman's movements, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the verdict. The eyes of the courtroom were all trained on him, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped as everyone held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The judge sat with an air of authority, but even he seemed to be caught in the suspense of the moment, the entire room waiting for the words that would change everything. The foreman cleared his throat and stood up, his voice calm, filled with an undeniable weight as he addressed the court. He read the verdict aloud with careful precision, and for a moment Emma's world seemed to stand still, the words coming out one by one, and yet everything around her seemed to blur, as though her mind couldn't fully grasp the gravity of what was happening. The foreman's words were clear and final, but Emma could hardly process them as they settled in her mind. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Nolan, guilty of gross misconduct in the arrest of Emma Carter." The words echoed in the courtroom, and Emma felt the room shift around her. It was as though the air had changed. Everything that had been building up to this moment finally culminated in a single breath. The tension that had gripped her for so long began to release as the reality of the verdict set in. The prosecutor stood up with a quiet smile of satisfaction as he turned toward the judge to address the court. The defense attorney sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration, but Emma could hardly focus on him. All she could hear was the thudding of her own heart as it began to slow, and her mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. She glanced at her father, who was standing beside her, his face set in a look of quiet relief, but even he was holding back his emotions. The victory was theirs. But it wasn't just his victory, it was hers too, and in that moment Emma felt a profound sense of justice. It was like the weight that had been pressing on her chest had finally lifted. The judge nodded solemnly and addressed the court, the legal procedures now taking precedence as he explained the next steps in the sentencing phase. But Emma hardly heard any of it. Her mind was still reeling from the verdict. It was finally over. After all the waiting, the pain, the uncertainty, the injustice she had faced, it had come to an end. But there was still something deeply unsettling about it, something that Emma couldn't shake, the feeling that she hadn't won a complete victory. Not yet. She had been vindicated, yes, but the scars of what had happened still ran deep inside her, and the journey to fully heal would take time. Her mother's hand found hers, and Emma squeezed it tightly as she turned to look at her family, who were all standing beside her now. Her parents, her brother, even her friends, who had supported her from the very beginning, were there watching as the legal battle ended, and the real work of healing began. Emma couldn't help but feel a mixture of gratitude and sadness. There was no way to undo what had been done, but there was still hope that somehow she could find a way to move forward from this moment and rebuild the trust that had been shattered. As the courtroom began to empty out, Emma stood with her family, ready to leave the weight of the trial behind her. But she knew that the real work had just begun, and no matter what came next, she would never forget the strength she had found in herself through it all. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave, but for Emma the noise seemed distant and muffled. Her mind was still consumed with the weight of the verdict. The reality of what had just happened felt surreal to her. She had been vindicated, yes, but it wasn't the victory she had imagined. It wasn't a clean and simple resolution. It wasn't just about proving that she had been wronged. It was about something deeper, something that she had only begun to understand in the quiet moments after the verdict was read. She had been a victim of injustice, but now she was faced with the task of healing and reclaiming what had been taken from her. Her family gathered around her as they walked out of the courtroom, her father's hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of support. But even he seemed lost in thought, his face tired from the emotional toll the trial had taken on him. They walked together through the halls of the courthouse and out into the bright daylight. But Emma's mind felt heady. She could hear the conversations around her, people talking about the trial, the case, the outcome, but none of it seemed to matter, not in that moment, not when her heart was still weighed down by the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. She didn't know where to go or what to do next. The sense of relief she had expected to feel after the verdict had been read hadn't come. Instead, she felt a sense of emptiness, like a piece of her had been lost in the process, like the parts of herself that had been exposed during the trial would never fully heal no matter how much justice she received. They walked together to the car, her mother trying to offer words of comfort. But Emma couldn't bring herself to respond, her thoughts swirling with the echoes of the trial, the images of Officer Nolan's testimony, and the harsh words that had been spoken in the courtroom. All of it felt like a blur now, a distant memory that she couldn't quite grasp, but she could still feel the sting of it deep within her chest. When they finally reached home, Emma found herself sitting in the living room, staring out the window, watching as the world outside continued on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for her. Everything felt different. Now, she wasn't the same person who had walked into that courthouse all those weeks ago. She wasn't the same person who had been arrested and humiliated in front of everyone. She had been through something that would stay with her forever. Her father sat beside her quietly as they both stared out the window, the silence between them comfortable but heady. Emma could feel the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her as she struggled to make sense of everything that had happened, her mind racing with questions and doubts. She had fought so hard for justice, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure how to move forward, how to rebuild her life after everything had been shattered. Her father's voice broke the silence as he spoke softly. "You did the right thing, Emma. You stood up for yourself. And you fought for what was right, and I'm proud of you for that." He paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, but you will get through this. You'll find your way." Emma nodded, but the words didn't quite reach her. She wasn't sure she believed them, not yet. She wasn't sure she even knew who she was anymore. But as she sat there beside her father, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone. Whatever came next, she had her family by her side, and that was something worth holding on to. The days that followed the trial were a blur of emotions and conflicting thoughts as Emma tried to navigate the aftermath of everything that had happened. The verdict had brought some measure of justice, but it hadn't brought the peace she had hoped for. She spent the next few days mostly in solitude, trying to process the overwhelming flood of emotions that came with being at the center of a public trial, trying to heal from the wounds that no one else could see. She found herself replaying the moments of the arrest over and over again. Each time it felt as if the weight of the injustice grew heavier and more suffocating. Her parents tried to give her space, but they also kept a close eye on her, watching for any signs that she was struggling too much. They wanted to help her find her way back to normal, but Emma couldn't quite remember what normal felt like anymore. She was constantly haunted by the memory of being treated like a criminal for something she had never done, and the shame she felt in that moment was something that clung to her no matter how much time passed. Her friends reached out to her as well. They sent messages and called to check in, offering support and comfort. But Emma found it hard to connect with them. They didn't understand what she had been through. They couldn't fully grasp the emotional toll of everything that had happened. And while their words were kind, they only served to remind her of how alone she truly felt in the midst of all this. At night, Emma found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the darkness in the room almost suffocating as her thoughts spiraled. She wondered if she would ever be able to trust anyone again the way she had before the arrest. She had always believed in the justice system, but now it felt like a fragile illusion that had crumbled right in front of her eyes. The people she had once looked to for protection had failed her in the most fundamental way, and Emma wasn't sure how to reconcile that with the person she had once been. It wasn't just the injustice of the arrest that weighed on her mind, it was everything that had come after, the way her life had been turned upside down, the way the story had been told about her as a criminal, the way she had been treated, as though she were guilty before she had even been given a chance to explain herself. She had been stripped of her dignity in front of everyone she knew and loved, and the scars of that humiliation ran deep. One afternoon, Emma decided to take a walk. She had been cooped up in the house for days, and the weight of the silence was starting to feel unbearable. She needed to clear her head, to be outside, to feel something other than the constant swirl of emotions that had taken over her mind. The air was crisp and cool as she stepped outside, her sneakers crunching against the pavement. As she walked through the neighborhood, she let her feet guide her as her thoughts drifted to a place of stillness. She was trying to find some sense of peace within herself, but it was difficult. The world around her seemed so much louder now. Everything felt overwhelming, as though the noise of life was closing in on her. She walked for what felt like hours, lost in her thoughts, until she found herself standing at the edge of a park, where the trees swayed gently in the wind. The sight of the peaceful scene before her grounded her. For a moment she took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to release some of the tension she had been holding inside her body. She realized in that moment that she couldn't carry the weight of everything on her own anymore. She had to start letting go. She had to find a way to move forward, even if she didn't have all the answers yet. It wasn't going to be easy, but Weeks passed and Emma found herself slowly coming back to life. She still struggled with the memories of what had happened, the shame and the hurt, but each day she took small steps toward healing. It wasn't easy. The process was messy and uneven. Some days she felt like she was back to square one, but on others, she felt a glimmer of hope, a reminder that healing wasn't a linear journey, that a winding path that took time and patience. Emma had started to find ways to cope with the trauma she had experienced. She spent more time with her family, who had been her constant source of support. She started to talk more openly about what had happened and allowed herself to feel the pain without burying it deep inside. One evening, Emma found herself sitting at a kitchen table with her parents. They were talking about the future and what life might look like now that the trial was over. It was an uncomfortable conversation because none of them knew for sure what the next steps would be, but Emma felt a sense of calm wash over her as she listened to her father's words. He had always been a steady presence in her life, but now his support felt even more powerful because he wasn't just standing beside her, he was helping her process everything. He wasn't rushing her through the healing process. He was allowing her to take her time, and that was something she hadn't realized she needed until now. Her mother joined in the conversation with soft words of encouragement, reminding Emma that she had the strength to move forward, that the hurt would eventually fade, and that her future was still wide open. Emma wasn't sure if she fully believed it, but hearing her parents speak with such certainty gave her a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she was missing. They had become her anchor in the storm, and together they would face whatever came next. It wasn't just her family that helped her, though. Emma also began to reconnect with her friends, the people who had stood by her during the trial. They'd reached out regularly, checking in with her and giving her space when she needed it. But Emma found herself slowly opening up to them again. She had been so withdrawn before, but now she realized that she wasn't alone in her struggle. They had all been affected by the events of the past months in their own ways, and in their own time they too had suffered watching her go through something so unfair. But they had also stood by her when it mattered most, and for that Emma was grateful. One afternoon, while sitting in the park where she had walked weeks earlier, Emma ran into someone unexpected. Officer Nolan, the man who had arrested her. He was standing by the swings with his head bowed as though deep in thought. Emma froze for a moment, unsure of what to do, but she took a deep breath and decided to approach him. She wasn't sure why, but in that moment she felt the need to confront him, to see him face to face, to understand what had driven him to make such a decision that night. Nolan looked up when he saw her approach, and his face seemed to falter for a moment. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Emma stood there for a moment, unsure of how to start the conversation, but then she simply said, "You know, you hurt me that night, don't you? You hurt a lot of people, and I don't think you ever really understood what that felt like." Nolan took a deep breath, his eyes filled with regret. As he nodded, he apologized softly, his voice almost breaking, and though Emma had no expectation of forgiveness, she felt something shift in that moment, something that gave her a sense of closure. She didn't need to forgive him to move forward, but confronting him and seeing his regret allowed her to release a small piece of the anger and hurt that had been festering within her. She wasn't bound by the past anymore. She was free to move on. As Emma left the park that day, she felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew now that she was stronger than she had ever realized, and that she had the power to shape her own path, moving forward one step at a time. As Emma walked away from the park, a sense of quiet peace settled over her. She had faced the hardest part of the journey, confronting the man who had wronged her, and in doing so she had taken back control of her story. She didn't need his apology to feel whole. She had come to understand that her healing wasn't dependent on his remorse or anyone else's. She had already started rebuilding herself piece by piece, and now it was time to move forward and embrace the life that awaited her. The days that followed felt different in a way Emma couldn't quite explain. It was as if she had unlocked a new chapter of her life, one where the past no longer held dominion over her every thought. She started to focus more on the things that mattered. She reconnected with old friends and made new ones. She returned to her passion for art, something she had put aside. In the midst of everything that had happened, she found herself drawing again, capturing moments of beauty in the world around her that had once seemed so distant and out of reach. It was as though she was learning to see life through a new lens, one that didn't include the shadows of her past. Her parents watched as she slowly began to flourish once again, their hearts swelling with pride as they saw the young woman she was becoming. Despite everything she had gone through, they knew their daughter had strength far beyond what they had imagined. They had always believed in her, but now they could see it for themselves, how much she had grown and how much she had taken back for herself. But even with all the healing, there were still moments when Emma would feel the weight of the past creep in, small reminders of the trial, the arrest, the humiliation. It wasn't something she could forget entirely, but it was something she could choose not to let define her. She had learned that healing was a continuous process, and that it was okay to take it one day at a time. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about finding peace with it and learning how to live fully again. One evening, Emma found herself standing on her balcony looking out at the city below, the lights flickering like stars in the distance, the wind rushing against her skin. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her for all that she had learned through the struggle, for the way she had found herself again, and for the people who had supported her through it all. As she stood there, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her friend Mia. It simply read, "Hey, just checking in, how's everything going?" Emma smiled as she typed her response, "I'm good, better than I've been in a long time, thanks for checking in." As she hit send, Emma felt a sense of calm settle in her heart. She wasn't the same person she had been before the arrest, but she was stronger for it, and she had come to realize that her worth had never been defined by that moment in time. Her worth had always been her own, and she was learning to live in a way that honored that truth. The future was uncertain, but Emma was no longer afraid of it. She was ready to face whatever came next with open arms and a heart full of hope. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, she knew that no matter what happened, she was ready to live her life fully, to embrace the new beginning that awaited her without fear or hesitation.